Ishmael Chapter 9, sections 9 and 10. Ishmael nodded to the stack of Bibles at my feet. According to the authors of that story, the people living between the Tigris and the Euphrates River had eaten at the God's own tree of knowledge. Where do you suppose they got that idea? What do you mean? Whatever gave the authors of this story the idea that the people living in the Fertile Crescent had eaten at the God's tree of knowledge? Do you suppose they saw it with their own eyes? Do you suppose that they were there when your agricultural revolution began? I suppose that's a possibility. Think, if they'd been there to see it with their own eyes, who would they have been? Oh, right. They would have been the people of the fall. They would have been the takers. And if they'd been the takers, they would have told the story a different way. Yes. So the authors of the story were not there to see it with their own eyes. How then did they know it happened? How did they know the takers had usurped the role of the gods in the world? Lord, I said, who were the authors of this story? Well, the Hebrews? Ishmael shook his head. Among the people known as the Hebrews, this was already an ancient story, and a mysterious story. The Hebrews stepped into history as takers, and wanted nothing more than to be like their taker neighbors. Indeed, that's why their prophets were always bawling them out. True. So though they preserved the story, they no longer fully understood it. To find the people who understood it, we have to find its authors. And who were they? Well, they were the ancestors of the Hebrews. But who were they? I'm afraid I have no idea. Ishmael grunted. Look, I can't forbid you to say, I have no idea, but I do insist that you spend a few seconds thinking before you say it. I spent a few seconds at it just to be polite, then said, I'm sorry, my grasp of ancient history is frankly negligible. The ancient ancestors of the Hebrews were the Semites. Oh, you knew that, didn't you? Yes, I guess so. You just weren't thinking. Right. Ishmael bestirred himself, and to be perfectly honest, my stomach clenched as the half-ton of him brushed past my chair. If you don't know how gorillas make their way from place to place on the ground, you can visit the zoo or rent a National Geographic videotape. No words of mine will make you see it. Ishmael lumbered or shambled or shuffled over to the bookcase and returned with a historical atlas, which he handed to me open to a map of Europe and the Near East in 8500 BC. A blade like a hand sickle very nearly cut the Arabian Peninsula away from the rest. The words incipient agriculture made it clear that the sickle blade enclosed the Fertile Crescent. A handful of dots indicated the sites where early farming implements had been found. This map, I feel, gives a false impression, Ishmael said, though it was not an intended impression. It gives the impression that the agricultural revolution took place in an empty world. This is why I prefer my own map. He opened his pad and showed it to me. As you see, this shows the situation 500 years later. The agricultural revolution is well underway. The area in which farming is taking place is indicated by these hen scratches. Using a pencil as a pointer, he indicated the area between the Tigris and Euphrates. This, of course, is the land between the rivers, the birthplace of the takers. And what do you suppose all these dots represent? Lever peoples? Exactly. They're not designed as a statement about population density, nor are they intended to indicate that every available stretch of land was inhabited by some lever people. What they indicate is that this was far from being an empty world. Do you see what I'm showing you? Well, I think so. The land of the fall lay within the Fertile Crescent and was surrounded by non-agriculturalists. Yes, but I'm also pointing out that at this time, at the beginning of your agricultural revolution, these early takers, the founders of your culture, were unknown, isolated, unimportant. The next map in the historical atlas is 4,000 years later. What would you expect to see on it? I'd expect to see the takers have expanded. He nodded, indicating that I should turn the page. Here, a printed oval labeled Chalcolithic cultures with Mesopotamia at its center enclosed the whole of Asia Minor and the land to the north and the east as far as the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. The oval extended southward as far as the entrance to the Arabian Peninsula, which was a cross-hatched area labeled Semites. Now, Ishmael said, we have some witnesses. How so? The Semites were not eyewitnesses to the events described in chapter 3 Genesis. He drew a small oval in the center of the Fertile Crescent. Those events, cumulatively known as the Fall, took place here, hundreds of miles north of the Semites, among an entirely different people. Do you see who they were? According to the map, they were the Caucasians. But now, in 4500 BC, the Semites are eyewitnesses to an event in their own front yard, the expansion of the takers. Yes, I see. In 4,000 years, the agricultural revolution that began in the land between the rivers had spread across Asia Minor to the west, and to the mountains in the north and the east, and to the south it seems to have been blocked by what? By the Semites, apparently. Why? Why are the Semites blocking it? I don't know. What were the Semites? Were they agriculturalists? No, the map makes it clear that they weren't part of what was going on among the takers. So I assume they were leavers. Leavers, yes, but no longer hunter-gatherers. They had evolved another adaptation that was to be traditional for the Semitic peoples. Oh, they were pastoralists. Of course, herders. He indicated the border between the takers' Chalcolithic culture and the Semites. So what was happening here? I don't know. Ishmael nodded toward the Bibles at my feet. Read the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis, and then you'll know. I picked up the one on top and turned to chapter 4. A couple minutes later, I muttered, Good Lord. After reading the story in all three versions, I looked up and said, what was happening along the border was that Cain was killing Abel. The tillers of the soil were watering the fields with the blood of the Semitic herders. Of course, what was happening there was what has always happened along the borders of taker expansion. The leavers were being killed off so that more land could be put under cultivation. Ishmael picked up his pad and opened it up to his own map of this period. As you see, the hen scratches of the agriculturalists have swarmed over the entire area, except for the territory occupied by the Semites. Here, at the border that separates tillers of the soil from the Semitic herders, Cain and Abel confront each other. I studied the map for a few moments and then shook my head. And biblical scholars don't understand this? I cannot say, of course, that not a single scholar has ever understood this, but most read the story as if it were set in a historical Never-Never Land, like one of Aesop's fables. It would scarcely occur to them to understand it as a piece of Semitic war propaganda. That's what it is, all right. I know it's always been a mystery as to why God accepted Abel and his offering and rejected Cain and his offering. This explains it. With this story, the Semites were telling their children, God is on our side. He loves us herders, but hates those murderous tillers of the soil from the north. That's right. If you read it as a story that originated among your own cultural ancestors, it's incomprehensible. It only begins to make sense when you realize that it originated among the enemies of your cultural ancestors. Yes, I sat there blinking for a few moments, then looked at Ishmael's map again. If the tillers of the soil from the north were Caucasians, I said, then the mark of Cain is this. I pointed to my own fair or maggot-colored face. It could be. Obviously, we'll never know for sure what the authors of the story had in mind. But it makes sense this way, I insisted. The mark was given to Cain as a warning to others. Leave this man alone. This is a dangerous man, one who exacts a sevenfold vengeance. Certainly a lot of people all over the world have learned that it doesn't pay to mess with people with white faces. Ishmael shrugged, unconvinced or perhaps just uninterested.